brainstorming. I'm sure you're familiar with that. A facilitated workshop with subject matter experts, team members, risk management team members, and any others, here's your stakeholders, who may be able to contribute. This should normally be facilitated. Don't be tempted to have the project manager facilitate it, since one category of risks would be management-related risks. So it's best to have an independent facilitator running the brainstorming session so the project manager can also take part in identifying risks. A good example here is that the risk categories we talked about could act as a trigger for further thoughts. So if you have got a risk breakdown structure, it would be a good thing to copy it onto a flip chart or something and pin it up on the wall as a constant reminder to all those involved in the brainstorming to help trigger further thoughts. Next up, the Delphi technique. Now this can be performed via email, as you'll discover shortly. You see, one of the strengths of this technique is that you don't actually get everyone in the same room. Because of potential conflicts or perceptions, you may not get full and complete information. If a particular individual is seen as a senior manager, for example, no one will want to counter any risks or ideas that person suggested. If an engineer saw another engineer as being much more experienced and knowledgeable than themselves, they may not wish to contribute any risks or ideas that countered the other person's ideas. So by having them separately, not in the same room, is very powerful. So you would want a facilitator, let's say me for example, and I would send emails out with a questionnaire to all those stakeholders that need to be involved. They would then fill out the questionnaire and return it back to me. Then the responses are organised by content and sent back to all for further changes or comments. Can you see, in this way it encourages all information to be available. It also allows a rapid consensus and stops any one person from influencing the others. Next up, the so-called nominal group technique. Again, this is a facilitated workshop. Each delegate would use post-it notes to record each risk. These are then gathered and a panel are then asked to review all these risks in terms of ranking and prioritising them. So in this way the workshop is used just to capture all available risks. So those attending the workshop are there to identify all the risks, but not to attempt to rank or prioritise them. Interviewing and/or expert judgment. Fairly obvious. Question and answer sessions held with anyone with a past experience of likely risks. Usually those with project knowledge, specialised knowledge or industry-specific knowledge. Again, one-on-one interviews can lead to a free and frank exchange of risks and ideas. Another very common tool you may have heard of, sometimes called the Fishbone diagram, although it is also known as an Ishikawa diagram named after the individual who discovered it. Its power is in cause and effect, by reverse thinking if you will. The idea here is to place a potential area of risk over here. It's called a fishbone diagram because it looks somewhat similar to the bones of a fish. You then want to come up with several risk categories. Here I've chosen material type risks, process type risks, hardware risks, and project staff. What you then do is to brainstorm potential root causes that could lead to inconsistent test results. So just taking this one, for example, under hardware, poor setup, that could be then seen as an individual risk in and of itself. And in terms of the response, you now have a very focused set of ideas of how you might stop that risk from occurring. So don't forget also existing risk checklists, any lessons learned, and risk registers from previous projects. Like I said earlier, don't forget lessons learned. And remember, statements such as there is a risk we might overspend our budget is not a risk, it's an impact. So you need to ask, why do you think we might overspend the budget? I'm sure you recall the 3 steps of identifying a risk, that is the risk cause, the risk effect, and the risk impact. Still on identify risks, there's another technique called assumptions analysis, which you'll recall I said that every assumption has at least one potential risk. So this is validating such assumptions that were identified during planning. Now, assumptions should be accurate, complete and consistent. In other words, unambiguous. All assumptions are potential risks and should be tested against criteria such as 1. The strength or validity of each assumption, and the impact consequences should the assumption prove to be false. And that in and of itself may cause them to be identified as a risk. Influence diagrams. These show the causal influences amongst the many project variables. They show the timing or time ordering of certain events and the relationships among other project variables and their outcomes. Let me show you the diagram so you understand better what I'm talking about. What they do is they visually depict risks or decisions, uncertainties or impacts. Here's a simple example. You can see here there are many potential risks involved. This is the exchange rate, which I happened to mention earlier. Importing the product. There may be risks around getting it quickly delivered from the country of origin to your country. Bad weather may be a risk. For example, importing products from the Philippines during the monsoon season. The schedule. Maybe the schedule is too tight, or there are key points where risks lay. And revenue. This obviously refers to the benefits, and if there's any risk there about generating sufficient revenue. You can see also on an influence diagram that these may interact in some way, here shown by these arrows. You've probably heard of SWOT analysis. It stands for strengths, weaknesses, opportunities and threats. The idea here is to gather answers to appropriate questions under each of these headings, and these could either be captured in a workshop, on the phone or email, but should include those with appropriate knowledge and experience in the subject area. Some ideas about what sort of questions ought to be asked under each of these. In the strengths, what are your advantages? What do you do well? Relevant resources and so on. I won't read all of these. Then you'd capture under the weaknesses that you have typically as an organisation. What could be improved? What is not performing as well as it should be? And what needs to be avoided? Opportunities are the reverse side of the coin. What does the system allow to be accomplished that could not be accomplished before the system was implemented? You're helping people here to think outside the box in many of these. And threats? What obstacles exist with regard to successful implementation or operations? You can see here we're talking about negative risks or threats, and here positive risks or opportunities. Having brainstormed this, perhaps on a large whiteboard, split into 4 quadrants, or by a series of 4 flip charts, what you then want to do is ask yourself, how can we maximize our strengths? How can we minimize or reduce our weaknesses? How can we grasp and make opportunities more likely to happen? And what can we do to minimize the impact of threats or to remove the threat entirely? So there'll be lots of cross-fertilization here. For example, you may find that some of your strengths could act to help reduce threats, while improving some of your weaknesses may give rise to more opportunities. Another way of presenting SWOT analysis is by taking each risk and numbering it as a small dot. I haven't shown the numbers here simply to fit this on the page, but you can see what we've got here, this being the axis for strengths, this being the axis for opportunities, this for threats, and that's for weaknesses. So if this was risk number 9, for example, you can see it doesn't have many threats against it, and your organisational weaknesses do not impact it very much. So again, what you'd want to do is to brainstorm how to improve your strengths, take action to increase the opportunities, take actions to reduce your weaknesses, and minimise or reduce or remove your threats.